Hi there, and welcome to Military Histories, a podcast from York Army Museum. Each week we share an interview from the Royal Dragoon Guards audio archive. Throughout June we will be sharing interviews with World War II veterans. You can find more details about the Royal Dragoon Guards Oral History project in the show notes. If you want to find out a bit more about our museum, there are links to our website and social media channels in the show notes too. In this week's interview you can hear Major General Henry Woods talk about deployment to Normandy, his experiences during the Second World War, including injury, and how the war ended on his 21st birthday. He goes on to describe his service in Korea, Aden and Benghazi. Major General Woods served with the 5th Inniskilling Dragoon Guards from 1943 to 1967. Thanks for listening. Future episodes will drop every Friday.
This is an interview by Colonel Mark Faulkner of Major General Henry Woods, CB, MBE, MC, DL, on Tuesday the 14th of February 2014 at Grafton House, Tockwith, North Yorkshire. General Henry, could you just tell me, first of all, to start the interview off, how you came to join the Skins?
Yes, it was largely by chance, as things often are in life. I told my troop officer at Sandhurst that I wanted to be a regular officer if one survived. And this was in October 1943. And he said, well, there are only two regiments, which if your father hasn't got much money, you should think about. One was the Skins and the other was the 11th Hussars. And so I said, well, my mother's family came originally from Ulster, so I thought the Skins was a good idea. And the commanding officer came to conduct interviews, and I found myself about 34th in a long queue. And of course, after an hour and a half or so, somebody came and said, well, that's it. Anybody who hasn't been interviewed, that's it for the day. And next thing I got was a letter from the adjutant to say, we're looking forward to your joining us.
So when you finished Sandhurst, you joined the regiment, that was during the war still?
Yes, the regiment was in Northumberland. And I was, of course, establishments were fairly large in those days. So every squadron had at least one or two supernumerary troop leaders. And as the newest joined in C Squadron, that's what I found myself doing, chores.
And at what stage did you deploy to Normandy?
Yeah, the regiment deployed to Normandy in July. We actually sailed, I think I might be saying, we sailed from Portsmouth in a landing craft infantry on the 19th of July and marched ashore off Rhino. Rhino was the enormous platform.
It was in Melbury Harbour.
Yeah, which is part of Mulberry Harbour. We didn't even get our feet wet. And we marched inland for about a couple of miles, and there was a wonderful sheet, a 160-pounder tin sheet,
right,
but on 4 poles, and 2 splendid warriors in the Royal Army Service Corps who had a line of cookers and burners, and out of the cookers we got a stew, out of we got hot tea, and that was our rations, and we lay down literally in a copse There were about 3 small copses, and each squadron had one. And then the following day, we were moved to north of Bayeux,
Right.
to a farmhouse. Because, of course, our very distinguished commanding officer, Colonel Teddy Swetnam, had, of course, got himself and the regiment involved in the war almost without anybody knowing. He'd arrived in France separately from the regiment and went to Montgomery's headquarters, said, "Here I am." They said, "Oh, we weren't expecting you." The regiment then had to get a whole lot of tanks which were in the sort of reserve tank park for the whole of the army group. And we started getting all the tanks ready. Of course, then the powers that be said that the 4th County London Yeomanry had had a very rough time at Villers-Bocage,
Yep.
and we were to relieve them in 22nd Army Brigade, which duly happened.
And so you fought through right till the end of the war?
Yes, and then I was a troop. Then I was either, it wasn't only me, but a good example. Sometimes I had a troop, sometimes I was just a tank commander in somebody else's troop. But this was the way that things happened. Tanks got booed up, somebody got hurt and had to be evacuated.
Yep.
And whoever was around at the time was then slotted into what they were doing. And my first contact with the crew of my tank, who then, by and large, I remained with them for most of the war. And we went up and sat on a ridge and were promptly mortared by the Germans. This was in the area of Montpinçon. And then the whole squadron eventually deployed onto Montpinçon. And then we were transferred over. The whole regiment was put onto transporters and were moved right across through the ruins of Caen, and it was a ruin too, to Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive, which, as its name implies, is on the River Dive.
Yeah.
And we crossed that on the way to the Seine. My first real experience of the nasty side of things was just outside a little township called Bourneville. B Squadron had been leading the regiment. They had arrived at a ridge, and from there on the ground sloped away northwards to the river, to the Seine.
Yep.
And B Squadron had been held up by being shot at by German anti-tank guns. I was sitting at the back of C Squadron, and John Woodhouse sent for me and said, "Go and join B Squadron. You're under command B Squadron, and help them to get forward." So I motored forward and came over this ridge. And suddenly there was a most shattering noise, and my tank had actually been hit. So I ordered the 2 rear tanks to stay where they were, back on the ridge, not to come onto the forward slope. The next tank, my corporal's tank, he was also hit. And so 2 crews gathered, somewhat shaken, under cavalry by the roadside.
Yep.
And then the battle moved on, and eventually there was no tank for us at that stage, so we were shuffled back into the echelon, and that really was my part, modest part, in what happened on the way up to the set.
Yeah.
Anyway, we drew another tank the following day from the echelon and rejoined my squadron. And I can remember very vividly the night before we were due to cross the Seine and take part in the great gallop up into Belgium and Holland. It poured with rain, so everyone was thoroughly miserable. Most people went and sheltered inside the tank because at least you only got one dribble, as opposed to people bivouacking alongside. And of course, in Normandy, then everybody dug a hole and backed the tank over it because of the German army's very effective use of mortars. Anyway, it poured with rain, everyone was thoroughly miserable, and the regimental column formed up. Before it was dark, we motored along and crossed at, I think, Les Andelys. Suddenly, there was a bridgehead of an infantry division. I can't remember which one it was. But suddenly we got through the bridgehead and the command came over the radio, 2 up. And everybody fanned out from having been a long single file column snaking along. And we motored like the devil for almost going flat out until we got to a little village called Abancourt, which is just south of the Somme. And we bivouacked there for the night. Because of course none of our tanks had any night fighting capability, whatever, other than the naked eye. And we went on the following day and passed Amiens, to the west of Amiens. We crossed the Somme and eventually reached the area of the Saint-Paul and La Bassée Canal. And just about half an hour before we reached that area, my driver said that the temperature in the gauge was alarmingly high. He used slightly more earthy language. And so we stopped and poured water into the radiators and then started up and motored on. And the same thing was happening again. Eventually, we crept into the Regiment harbour area, the last to arrive, and it became plain then that the engine had seized up completely. So we again were back to the echelon, and then there was a pause because there weren't any tanks north of the Seine available for somebody to take over. So the next, I think, the only other, two other things I would say about the fighting. One was when, in the winter, when when the whole of the division were involved in an operation called Operation Blackcock. And this was a winter operation to clear the funny triangle just south of Roermond between the Maas and the Roer. And we had great dramas there, because we started off at first light on the 21st of January 1945, and we motored all day. In those days, a lot of this was fits and starts. Move a couple of miles, stop, then go on. So covering a comparatively small distance took an inordinate amount of time. And in the evening, we could see the battle going on. With B Squadron of the regiment were involved in a place called Aden, which was almost on the River Rock. And suddenly the squadron was told to embark a whole company of the Queen's Regiment, who clambered on, sat on top, and they all had their greatcoats rolled up, except for a few. I became very worried. This greatcoat hanging over the side of the tank would drag the unhappy infantrymen. So we persuaded them to put all their greatcoats on top of the turret, and then we motored it through it's actually, I think today you'll find it's a Dutch state forest, and finally arrived and dismounted the infantry. And the following day, we attacked with another lot of infantry a place called Aden, and one of our more distinguished troop leaders, Hugh Craig Harvey, he kept on getting tanks shot from underneath him. I was advancing parallel to him, and for some reason or other I was spared, escaped. And he got an MC for that, quite rightly too. And the other time was after the crossing of the Rhine. Again, we were motoring from one village or township to another. And one place, the RAF had bombed the place so thoroughly that no one could get through. So I was told to go along and see if I could find a crossing to the east of this township. And I did, and I found a railway line. So he started easing the tanks one at a time. It was a very rickety bridge.
Was that Sahatengebosch?
Sorry?
Was that Sahatengebosch?
No. That was, this was Stadlon.
Sadlon.
Oh yes, until we came to start getting the tanks off the railway line. If you can imagine, a tank track would fit very neatly underneath a sleeper.
Yeah.
The sleeper would then rise and take the tank track off the idler or one of the wheels. So we had a hell of a job, and then motored on through the night, and eventually caught up with the Rifle Brigade, who had found another route round to the west of Stadtlohn. And I think they were very relieved to see us, because they were completely out of touch with anybody, and being shot at, and feeling somewhat lonely and miserable. I played a very minor part in the Sertogenbosch battle. There, because of a shortage of tanks, I was a crew commander in Bill Aykroyd's troop. And I think the only notable occasion then was the evening of the second day, and we had reached Bound, and we were ordered to halt. I didn't know this at the time, but there was a frightful row going on between my squad leader and the infantry battalion commander. We were just sitting there. I was beside a barn, and suddenly, into view, motoring at right angles to me, were two German self-propelled guns. So, it was absolute God's gift, about 100 metres range. They weren't expecting anybody. Neither was I. I think what was notable about that was I managed to recover my surprise rather more quickly than they did. So we blew both of them up. But that was the Sertogenbosch battle was very largely fought by A and B squadrons, and our battle, it was a perfectly genuine battle, was subsidiary to theirs. And that was the reason why we were halted, because they were behind. Yes.
And where did you end the war?
Sorry?
Where were you when the war came?
Well, I was actually in hospital in Brussels, because at a place called Ibbenburen, I was sent for and told to go be under command A Squadron, who were battling their way through the Teutoburger Wald.
Yep.
And they had managed to get through the first wooded ridge. And they were actually in a sort of plain between Ridge 1 and Ridge 2. And Ibbenburen, again a small German town, not far from Osnabrück,
Yep.
was the far side of the plain. And coming to it, as we were from the south, there were bags of houses. There was a farm, and the farm buildings, and I suppose what we would call ha-ha wall.
Yep.
This side of it. And mine and another troop had been detached to a squad, and we were both trying to advance and trying to get the infantry forward. And the infantry came under heavy fire. The heavy fire came from this ha-ha wall, or behind it.
Yep.
And the other thing was the sniping. Two chaps were killed outright. The other troop leader of my squadron was killed on my left, and troop leader of A Squadron was killed. And after that, I kept my head down. But in the evening, when the Germans had withdrawn, we motored on about 1,000 yards and came to the leading company of the infantry. And the idea was that my troop would spend the night with them. So I left the main road, having met one of their sentries. And so I said, well, I'll guide my tank in. So I walked in front of the tank. And suddenly there was a burst of fire. I won't say who from, but I was shot in the leg. So anyway, I was bundled onto my tank, and that was used to take me back to A Squadron headquarters, who were only just a few yards back down the road, and from there I was transferred, through the normal chain, and finished up in Brussels. And then I was granted sick leave. That was fine, 3 weeks sick leave back in UK. So on the day that the war ended, which also happened to be my 21st birthday party, I was sitting waiting for a passage to Tilbury, and I heard the most tremendous. I was at a place called Coq-sur-Mer, which is one of these reinforcement holding units, and I remember hearing the most tremendous feu de joie from a Czech brigade who were besieging Dunkirk. And suddenly, at the end of this tremendous firework display, silence. And of course we'd been told that the war was coming to an end. So that's the end of that war.
And then you talk about the British Army of the
Oh
Line,
yes, I think
being
probably
building
no
arms.
further thing to say is that we established a tremendous reputation in BOR, both because we were, as the Royal RDG are today, very professional. We also, of course, had tremendous sporting successes. And Peter Duckworth and the pentathlon, very good reputation. There was Peter Duckworth of pentathlon and other officers, Tony Millen, for example, and he was then Lance Corporal Bright, but eventually he was Sergeant Bright, who were all, they were the backbone of the British Army pentathlon team. There was, and of course horses played a prominent part. There was scarcely a fortnight went by without some equine activity somewhere. Horse shows. We ran for 3 years, I think. We ran what was then called the Rhine Army Horse Show. And nearly all the people were eventually persuaded to help with the British
team.
Yeah, with actually running. Nearly all the people we used within the regiment eventually finished up running the International Horse Show at Olympia or Wembley or wherever.
So a real feather in your cap.
Well, one was, yes, for me, I was a cog in a machine.
And at what stage did you deploy to Korea?
I was in fact, I commanded the advance party. So I left at the beginning of November. I'm sorry, wrong. I left in the middle of October. And then you have to add sailing time. Long before the days of air trooping. We really had a glorified holiday at Her Majesty's expense, going ashore at places like Aden and Colombo and Singapore and Hong Kong. And General Charles Keatley, who was then the colonel of the regiment, he was in Singapore as Commander-in-Chief, Far East Land Forces. And everybody was bidden, except for some hapless person who was the orderly officer. Everyone was bidden ashore and entertained and so forth. Korea itself was a bit of a shock. It got there because all these mountains, hills, were covered in snow. And we started off with this amazing rail journey from Busan, where we disembarked, all the way up to Uijeongbu. I can spell that for you later if it would help. Which is the railhead. And there are the 8 Hussars who we were relieving, were there, greeted us with that well-known army reviver, fortified tea, bags of rum.
Yep.
And the advance party had takeover responsibilities in producing the takeover plan. And I was actually at that moment the regimental signals officer. And at the beginning of December, I think it was the 2nd of December, the main body of the regiment arrived at Busan and again had the same extraordinary rail journey in antiquated, very uncomfortable wooden carriages. And Korea, really, for the regiment, was like going back to the Second World War. Rather like, I imagine, the fighting in Italy. Casino and all that.
Yeah.
There was the extraordinary mountains and hills. And we sat on one range of hills which roughly followed the 38th parallel. And the tanks were dug in, enormous, eventually. And we had to do this because we had 2 occasions when we suffered severe losses, when a mortar bomb or a shell actually plummeted straight down and blew up inside a tank. Sort of very nice. As I say, we finished up with these enormous bunkers, miles of sandbags, and I think the most notable thing, I mean, that's my memory is because I then became adjutant, and my memory is mostly of dealing with all the problems an adjutant is supposed to deal with.
Yeah.
And I wasn't very involved, except on two occasions, the two occasions when we did raids into enemy lines. And our business of coordinating air, artillery, tank guns, mortars, etc., and making sure they did what they were told, proved, quite a major task. But that was my closest to seeing Chinaman, though I was taken up. I remember a light-hearted thing. I remember going to visit one troop who was sitting on one ridge and looking across at another one about half a mile away. And it was pointed out to me that there was a trench which ran along the crest of the ridge, and it finished up with a little roof. And Chinese soldiers were seen at regular intervals walking along the path. But some time before we realized what they were actually doing, it was their loo. So we put a shell into it. And I think, yes, I refer you only, because I think your best source of information about Korea is that.
Tracks in Korea by Captain C.J. Baldwin. Yep.
Which has just been published.
So, after Korea, you went to Catterick?
We had no. I think the regiment were ill-used, God knows by who. But instead of going home, we went to Shandor camp in the Canal Zone, which is the worst, most bloody awful camp I've ever been in. There were miles of sand, some tin huts, a little cluster of quarters in the middle, and the soldiery were under canvas. And when a Ghibli blew up, it really was most unpleasant. And the amenities for the soldiers were absolutely nil. Yeah. And poor old Dick Vigors went storming off to British troops, Egypt headquarters, to protest loud and long. Of course, everybody knew that we were on the way out from Egypt and the Canal Zone. Yeah. And so, of course, there was no money to do anything. I mean, we organised all sorts of things. We organised swimming in the Red Sea, snorkeling, and all these brightly coloured fish. And we mounted expeditions into the Sinai Desert, up to St. Catherine's Monastery, and we did everything possible. And we had film shows once a week, etc. But the soldiers, whose morale, as usual, survived almost everything, were really pretty unhappy, having had a year in Korea, separated from their families, and then having the same again for a further year at Chandor. And I think the only thing personal thing of note was I had the privilege of commanding the regimental detachment in the coronation procession of Her Majesty. It was a great privilege and a light-hearted story. Squadron Sergeant Major Gower was in the detachment. We had the standard, etc. And rather my description of advancing in France, the procession went in fits and starts. And there was one superb moment when we had halted near the bottom of St. James's Street, i.e. our backs were to the front of St. James's Palace. And there was a very merry party going on in the first floor of a house. And somebody threw down some coins. And I heard Sergeant Major growl, first man who picks up a coin, I'll have him. And nobody did.
So at the end of the coronation, you then went to Catterick, did you?
Well, no, we still had the coronation was in June, and so we actually moved to Catterick in December.
So it took the regiment that long to get back.
Yes, I mean, the detachment, of course, apart from myself and Sergeant Major Gower, were nearly all chaps who were at ERE in England anyway. There were 8 of us altogether. And the late ex-Sergeant Pooley, he was, I remember he was next to me. There was a whole block, 8 wide, from all the Royal Armoured Corps regiments. Marvellous, great day. So on the way, of course, it tried to rain. Thank God it stopped. I've never liked the smell of wet serge. So I think, yes, and Catterick, again, was a great opportunity to play sport, as well as to do the training regiment job. And all sorts of characters came to the fore. I suppose I should mention here the extraordinary example that Colonel, long afterwards, General Monkey Blacker played. If one wanted an example, who I think is one of the few commanding officers who's gone 3 rounds in the boxing ring.
And so, how long were you in Catterick for?
Well, I personally was in Catterick only for 21 months.
And from there you went to?
Because then I went to the pre-staff college and then the staff college, and then my first staff appointment.
Which was what?
GSO2 Armoured School and Infantry at Warminster.
And so when did you rejoin the regiment after that?
1960.
And that was in Senlager?
And that was, that's Senlager.
And the regiment's role in Senlager was that...
Sorry?
The regiment's role in Senlager was part of...
The regiment was then the armoured regiment with 2nd Division.
And it was a round of training and...
Yes, I mean, at that stage, we still had a flow of national service people, all ranks, and they took us up to establishments,
yep,
as opposed to the regular corps in the middle. But actually, I've nothing but praise for national service people. I mean, in Korea, for example, or just when we were forming up to go to Korea, over 100 of them volunteered a sort of gentleman's agreement, so they would not insist upon being shipped back to England after only 6 months in Korea. The War Office, I think quite sensibly, said anybody with less than 9 months won't go because it's too expensive. And but again, their spirit, their liveliness. If you look back in the journals at the time, you will see the most marvellous cartoons, which were drawn by a clerk in the quartermaster's department.
Which told the whole story.
Yeah, he was called Old Topple Primer. And he, and they were all, too, because they were all, to put it bluntly, they were all from all walks of life. And they assimilated training.
Yeah.
I think certainly slightly more quickly than, for instance, from what one reads, pre-1914 regular soldier who, not perhaps had quite the intelligence of the national service people we had.
Because they came from all walks of life.
Right, yeah. They were very good. But yes, Catterick. Yes, I think the sporting side, we won the Cavalry Cup then. And while still at Catterick, I can't remember how I managed this. Oh, I was already at the Staff College. And we had a tremendous parade in Inniskilling for the laying up of the original 6th Inniskilling Dragoons standard in St. MacCartan's Cathedral, which I know was replicated quite recently.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
History repeating itself.
Well, yes. I mean, Mikey Blacker was a most outstanding person in every possible way. One of the remarkable things he did, which is relevant to this, was before 1956, the regiment had no settled recruiting area, And so Monkey marched himself into the old War Office and sought an interview with the Adjutant General and said, I've got a plan. All the cavalry regiments should have their own areas of recruiting. Up till then we had none. And from that, our connections with Cheshire, our connections, of course, the revival of our connections with Inniskilling, the posting of sergeants of the regiment for tours, recruiting, all of that stemmed from Monkey saying, I've got an idea.
And that remains
and that's still
system
still
today.
going now.
Yeah,
Still,
a great legacy.
so I thought to put that in as an example of the sort of gung-ho, almost, go-ahead atmosphere which Monkey again created. You know, the vibes went out to people.
And we were talking about Senlager. You were a squadron leader in Senlager, were you?
Yes, I commanded a squadron, and then this was Harry Walker in command, and my squadron were with the Grenadiers, the 3rd Grenadiers, and we had just finished, or were about to finish, a joint training session at Vogelsang on the German-Belgian border. And remember vividly, the Grenadiers gave a sort of cocktail party, I think to say thank you to the people in the permanent staff of Vogelsang. And we were all in tents and marquees and so forth. And a ramrod stiff grenadier marched up to me, said, mess corporal or something, stamped his feet in typical Guardy fashion, and said, "Sir, you wanted on the telephone." So all it was a miserable field telephone in a corner, in one corner of this enormous marquee, and at the other end was this party going on. I said, "Hello, Harry," at the other end. I said, "Can you hear me?" I said, "But with difficulty." And he said, "The second in command has, for family reasons, has had to resign his commission and has gone. And I want you to come back and take over as second in command." So I was actually about to have a weekend in Brussels with Imogen. And I said, I know it sounds sort of perhaps a bit touch selfish, but what about my weekend? And he said, "Oh, have that. Then come straight back, hand over to Richard Keatley," which I did. And then, again, a very exciting, exhilarating time with Harry and with the 1961 Standard Parade, which it sounds as though I was boasting. It's not meant to be so. But Harry, I think Harry had bottle explosions of temper. And one of the objects of his wrath on occasions were people like quartermasters and so forth. He found something he disapproved of. And I found myself as a sort of go-between, making sure that if people had genuine problems, we knew what they were. Yeah. And if they weren't, then perhaps not always, they didn't always feel a full flow of Harry's wrath. But an exciting time, and again, the regiment had a high, I think, a high reputation in BOR. Again, largely based on the sporting model.
And when you left Senlager, you went
I went, or actually what happened was my father died, and I went to Harry and said, was there any chance at all? I would have been due to go back on the staff anyway. Was there any chance at all of a job in England to help my mother? And Harry said, well, see what we can do. And a fortnight later, I was posted to the Ministry of Defence.
And then you rejoined the regiment.
And then rejoined the regiment in 1964.
As commanding officer at this stage?
No, I'm just, sorry, you were leaning forward, I wasn't quite sure. All right. Yes, I rejoined the regiment as Gavin Murray's second in command. I was beginning to have a real understanding of what a second in command is supposed to do. And again, the moment I arrived, we were involved in the planning of the move to a one-year unaccompanied tour in Aden. And again, I found myself doing the advance party business. So I left, I think, in November 1964. And then there we had, in contrast to the Richard camp at Chandur, at Little Aden, we had superb air-conditioned huts to sleep in. I think it's almost universal truism. Nobody minds being hot, very hot during the day. It was just your working hours, so working from very early in the morning until late lunch, and then everyone collapses. But what really gets people, maximum heat in the desert, is night time. Because you're sweating, heat, and so on. It makes one very miserable.
Can't sleep.
And very bad-tempered. Yes, I think the regiment, again, we were in a funny situation. We had one squadron embarked on landing ship tank in the Persian Gulf. One squadron in Hong Kong, and the rest of the regiment, less detachments, in Little Aden. And I found myself occasionally as commanding officer, with kind of tensions, where one was the piggy in the middle, where I felt it was my job to go and visit the outstations, i.e. the embarked squadron and the squadron in Hong Kong. And I had to go and argue the case to the GOC in Aden. I said to him, you know, how can I be satisfied that material standards are being maintained if I can't get out of Aden?
So did you got your way and got to Hong
Kong? Some persuasion. And then, of course, we started planning for the move back to England, Curtin and Lindsay. I'm sorry, to Libya. Libya comes in between.
So you didn't go back home? You went
So
straight to
everyone
Maiden
had
Lady.
some leave. And the great thing about Libya was that there were quarters, manned quarters, for, I think, everybody who was entitled. And again, there were clubs, swimming clubs, and so forth. And we had, there was slightly less horse activity than I would have liked, but there was polo. And but for the outbreak of the 1967 war, most people, while not perhaps being terribly pro-Arab, might have felt that the life in Libya was it wasn't all roses. It wasn't complete hell, which Chandor had been.
So, during your time as commanding officer in Libya, what happened? What events happened?
Well, yes, I think the two notable events that I remember was, in fact, the escape of then Captain Gaddafi, who was the signals officer of the Libyan Armoured Car Regiment. And for interior political reasons, of which I know nothing, he decided he had to escape to Egypt, to worship Nasser. And this regiment were in camp near the Egyptian border, and the commanding officer was woken by the sound of engines roaring, and stumbled out of his tent, seeing flash 3 armoured cars take off and go into Libya. If they had been stopped, perhaps history would have been different.
Yeah.
But they weren't. I think the other, oh yes, the only other event was Sea Squadron had organised an expedition to erect American bomber, which had called the Lady Be Good, which had lain undisturbed for 40 years or so then. And I decided to mount a bit of an exercise for the helicopters, which we just acquired. And Staff Sergeant Strafford was detailed to fly me down to the Lady Be Good. We went down to the BP camp near Elagala and filled up with petrol, with fuel, and then took off again. After about half an hour, our electrics failed, and Staff Sergeant Stafford, brilliant piloting, brought me down by a BP landing strip. It was just marked with oil barrels. Yeah. And of course we couldn't talk to anybody because we had no electrics, we had no power, nothing. So we could only hope that eventually somebody would realise we were missing. Well, I'm glad to say we spent a rather uncomfortable night sitting in the cockpit of this helicopter, and at about midday the following day, an RAF aircraft from Aden came storming along the runway. Of course, we rushed out and waved and so forth, and that was our rescue.
And when did you leave the regiment from Libya, or as commanding officer?
Sorry?
Did you finish your tour as commanding officer in Libya?
Yes, I did, yes.
And handed over to...
I think the only other thing really to say about Libya is the events of the 67 war.
Yeah.
Again, we had just indulged in all sorts of Queen's birthday dues. You know, I had a regiment on parade with the standard, etc., and we trooped the standard, etc.
Yep.
And the then Consul General, Sir Peter Wakefield, took the salute, and then we had I think we had a cocktail party or something for all the local Brits, for the Queen's birthday that evening. And the following day, suddenly, all hell was let loose, and there were the regimental camp was about 300 yards off the main ring road round Benghazi. And suddenly we saw trucks commandeered with flags, people shaking their fists and shouting and so forth. And we speedily realized we had a major crisis on our hands, because many of our families lived in hiring flats in Benghazi. Yeah. And you know what was happening to them. So anyway, I think we reacted fairly quickly, and we got things organised. The families were all brought in by coaches instead, driven by Libyans, but without any problem at all, until we had two wives who were unaccounted for, and last report was that they were in their flats, but they were in the middle of the town, and they weren't quite sure what to do. I don't think they had a telephone. See. So all of this was relayed to us via Libyan sources. So we tried to organise a relief expedition, and Charles Taylor's squadron, Sea Squadron, they went in to the middle of Benghazi. But actually, what had happened, of course we didn't know this at the time, was these two wives had been very sensible. They'd gone downstairs, they'd hailed a taxi. And the taxi man said, I'll get you out of this, because there was a mob at the end of the street. He said, I'll get you out of this. And did. Then, of course, we had to extricate Charles and his squadron. And that's where he had his command vehicle with him, because otherwise he had no means of talking to me.
Yeah.
So that was set on fire, and Charles got very badly burnt, I'm afraid. But so did two of the other people. We had a military policeman and someone else, I can't remember who, but there were two people who were also burnt. And at the time, we had B Squadron across the peninsula in the harbour area. The peninsula had all the diplomatic housing, etc., except for two things. One was the British Council offices. They were largely staffed by Libyans, so they shot out the back door as the mob surged in and set that on fire. And at the same time, another bit of the mob was threatening the United States consul offices. And there we simply couldn't get to them during the day. But we organised, we managed to talk to them. They had telephone, so we could talk to them. All the other people, British military mission with Libya, people like that, they were all taken into the headquarters barracks, which was the old Italian barracks.
Yep.
And so by evening, we had all the families. We erected tentage for our soldiers, and the wives and children that moved into the better accommodation. And they were there for about a week, I suppose. But it was a slightly hairy time.
Yeah.
And yes, I think by the time I left in October, of course, everything was more or less back to where it had been. But relations with the Libyans were always, I think, thereafter slightly uncertain. One didn't quite know when a mob would suddenly arise. Almost got to the end, haven't we?
Yes, I think we have Just to finish, General Henry, would you like to just say something about your life after you finished command of the regiment?
Yes. Well, I spent a year and a half as Assistant Military Secretary to the Commander-in-Chief, British Army of the Rhine, who was then an ex-8 officer, General Shan Hackett,
Yep.
who again was a brilliant master and was not averse to a bit of skullduggery on the quiet, with the highest of motives. As an example, he wrote a letter criticising the development of government policy as regards numbers games in BOR. And Mr. Healy, who was now Lord Healy, who was then Secretary for Defence, was absolutely furious. A senior officer should write this, and wanted him fired on the spot. And so General Shan rang Healy, said, "I hear you're very angry with me, Secretary." "Yes," said angry voice at the other end. "Well," said Shan, "I would draw attention to the fact that I didn't write as Commander-in-Chief, British Army of the Rhine. I wrote as Commander, Northern Army Group." Now it's a NATO appointment.
Yeah.
And, of course, he couldn't be touched.